Hello and welcome to the 137th episode of the Hope Illuminated podcast, where we share powerful stories, science, and well-being strategies. Here, isolation and despair can be defeated and a passion for living rekindled. No flashlight required for our journey, just fired up listeners ready to gain guidance from myself and our international experts. Today, we're going to be talking with my dear friend, Barb Smith, a longtime collaborator on the importance of supporting communities in the aftermath of suicide and why we need to be proactive. And she and I were just chatting about our dear friend, I call him the father, the granddaddy of all things postvention, Frank Campbell, about the canyon of why that people fall into after a suicide and why sometimes it takes so long for them to find the support they deserve. So welcome to the show, Barb.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited of all the ways that we've partnered together and how some of those things are still standing today, and of all the things that we'll be doing in the future. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do every day?
Every day's a different day, right? So our network is the Suicide Resource and Response Network. We're based out of Saginaw, Michigan, but we serve and care for the state of Michigan. And our mission is to prevent suicide through education, advocacy, connection to resources, and care for people impacted by suicide. And what that long mission statement means is that we like to do a lot of prevention efforts, which is upstream. So we do a lot of training efforts in the high school, middle schools, community, state, national conferences. And then we connect people to resources. So when someone is struggling, we are not a crisis line. However, we do answer a lot of calls because, as you know, as a speaker, when someone meets you, they then tend to trust you and they feel comfortable having the conversation. So someone might call with a concern of a family member, coworker, or someone they care about, and we'll walk them through where to best get their services, how to care for them and get them the help that they need in a very helpful way. And then the aftercare is we do our loss team, victims advocate, and we have a survivor support group for families impacted. And then our advocacy work is I'm on the Governor's Suicide Prevention Commission and multiple groups around the state of Michigan, hoping to make change for how we care for people impacted by suicide. So my
Wow.
everyday life can anywhere is being helping someone after someone has died, but also as a trainer, which I absolutely love doing upstream.
Yes, well, that's a lot on your plate, a lot on the
Yeah.
buffet of ways you're making an impact. And today we're really going to talk about that aftermath piece, the
Mhm.
part that those of us in the work call postvention, and more so postvention on communities rather than, you know, long-term bereavement counseling, that kind of model. So we're looking at what we need to do when people have had this worst tragedy, this horrible nightmare come true for them. How can we proactively reach out to them? And Barb, I was thinking about and preparing for this back in the day. We used to do what I call postvention light through our eye care packages. And this is something that I think a lot of communities that care about this can do on the fly. Just proactively reach out to families with at least some tips and tools and, transitional objects. We had little felty hearts and little teddy bears in our care package just to let people know we see you and we understand that this is a very, very difficult journey. So we're going to unpack all of that today. But let's first know a little bit more about you, Barb. Why do you care so much about this? What is your why?
Well, my why is similar to yours. So my brother John was 20 years old when he took his life. And, 35 years ago, there were no resources. It was untalked about. We think about the stigma we have now. It was not good that many years ago. So I was young and a little bit, I guess, a little feisty. And so I thought I'm going to learn to care for people impacted. So we were the second longest running support group in the state of Michigan. And I went and I got trained by Iris Bolton right from the Link Counseling Center. She was really our pioneer for
Hmm.
postvention. So that's where I really started is I wanted to be that person that people could count on and turn to after a death to suicide. And that's really where my journey became. And then since then, my sister-in-law took her life at the age of 43, was not this brother's wife, but my youngest brother's. And, it really began our journey of what do we do? Like this happened, now what?
Yes. Yes, our pathways are very similar. I do feel like the support group that I stumbled into, like literally we Googled and we just happened to find this group that had been around 15 years. They were so well established. Vivian Epstein was facilitating it. It was actually called Parents Surviving Suicide, but they let me in. And it was just so beautifully run. And I stayed with it for 18 months. My mother stayed with it for about a decade, where she eventually became a mentor. But it was, having people who really understood how complicated and overwhelming this journey is for a lot of people, and just providing that unconditional place where people have to tell their stories over and over again, and
Yeah.
everybody understands the importance of that, was just so helpful to us and our family in that very difficult time. What fuels your passion today?
I love both. I love doing the upstream and the prevention because I really enjoy and appreciate the training people where we get to, by the end of the training, we've moved the needle to that stigma of, you asked directly about suicide? Yes, we do. And
Hmm.
you have a conversation, like, don't we send them to behavior health? No, we don't. We can
Hmm.
just be that listening ear and offer them resources to decrease their pain. But also in the aftermath of suicide, when I leave our families, and my other teams, it's like we leave them with hope. And also for the law enforcement, like they feel cared for and they don't have to do the emotional support. Like they can do their investigation. But when I have families come back with these stones that we leave every family member, like their hope stones, and I go to a restaurant 10 years later and they pull their stones out of their pocket, or they come to group a year later and they're still carrying that stone. It's so symbolic. Like, you will survive. It might not feel like it right now, but you will. And I'm that hope message. I'm your light. I'm telling you, Sally, there's nothing more, I guess, fulfilling than to know that if we weren't with that family early on, how lonely that journey would be. So
Yes.
I'm fulfilled by the hope that we bring those in the early hours of the death by suicide.
Yes. I mean, and I do feel, I guess, blessed that I had some awareness after Carson died that there
Yeah.
would be resources, because I think most families don't. And even though I had some awareness that there would be resources, I still felt like we might be the only family that this has happened to. And that
Yeah.
sense of profound tragedy coupled with that profound isolation was just devastating. So to know, have someone come alongside and say, you're not alone. Many other families sadly has walked this path, and we're here for you because we know how hard it is. That proactive outreach obviously helps the family. It also helps like the second and third tier people around the family who have little knowledge about
Yeah.
what to do or say. And it
Yeah.
also helps the first responders. Can you talk about how your teams, when they roll up to a scene? I know for me, when I was doing this work a million years ago, the first responders would go, you know,
Yeah.
we're not equipped to deal with this emotional intensity. Thank you so much for showing up. Can you talk about how this also helps like our first responders who are on these scenes?
Well, I think it really allows them to do their investigations, do the work that they need to do in a safe way for them, because it's not easy for them to have to interview families after a loss to suicide. All the questions, because we know that suicides are treated as a homicide. And so families are often interrogated, investigated, their pictures are taken, and, it can feel horrible for the law enforcement who have a job to do, and then for the families, like, it really can intensify depending on how they do their interviews, as to making the family feel like they are the ones that killed their loved one. So for law enforcement, like, we're the hand holding it. Exactly what you said. When we show up on a scene in our burgundy polo shirts, the officer's like, Barb, you go take care of the family. We got stuff to do. And, it's an honor to be with families in those worst moments. It really is an honor. But for our law enforcement, it really is helpful to them so they don't walk away feeling like they're left unsettled as well. So
Mhm.
we debrief with them when we leave a scene. We check in with them afterwards. And, we ask them the same questions. What was the hardest thing about this call that you went on? And what do you feel good about? And, is there anything else that we can do? And then we intervene on some of the calls. Like, family members have a lot of questions. In our law enforcement, there's a shortage of staff, like in many departments. They don't have the time and capacity because they're going to the next scene, they're going to the next family. So we have more time to spend with them, to handhold, answer those questions, get the questions answered for them in a sensitive way. So it's an honor to work beside our law enforcement and first responders.
Yes, and another term thing that you do for your community is offer these lost survivor convenings. Is there, which I think is just so special, for people to come together, once a year or whenever to just embrace each other wherever they are in their grief journey. Is there any particular highlight or something that has stuck out to you over the years of a situation or particular family where you're like made a difference with that family? Again, without sharing any identifying information, just more the circumstance where like, these people were struggling, and because of some of this postvention support, they were able to take a step forward.
I think, and this wasn't, I didn't know you were gonna ask that question, but I think the first family that came to my mind, it's been a couple years, but on the scene of a father who took his life, we just brought the support. The two sons were very quiet. They were probably 21, 24, and they sort of stood in the background, and we were caring for his wife and their father, and then, the deceased older parents. And then I was called a couple of months ago, and that had been maybe 4 years ago. I was called back to the home for the adult son who was, I didn't know it at the time, was thinking of suicide, but he just was struggling with his father's death and his purpose now. And he had dropped out of school. He didn't know what to do, broke up with his girlfriend, because we know when they don't get help early on, there's a lot of ripple effect, right? So I went back to the family, and the mom said, we just don't know what to do. Like, how do we survive this? And I said, sometimes in death by suicide, other families members start to think about their own life and taking their own life. And the son just started sobbing. And I
Mm.
said, so I'm wondering, by the tears that you're sharing and the way you put your head down, if you thought about suicide lately. And he looked at his mother and he goes, yes.
Mm.
The mom didn't know, his brother
Mhm.
didn't know, and because we did it in this caring way and we sort of normalized, like, it's not unusual for another family member to think of suicide, he felt safe in saying it, and we were able to get him help within 48 hours, and it was beautiful. Like, we went there to talk about his dad, but really it was his thoughts of suicide that came out, and his mother, she had no idea, his brother had no idea. So I feel like even though we were supporting them in grief, we also helped prevent another death to suicide.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize how common that is because the pain of suicide is so intense. Uh,
Mm,
B, there's also survivor guilt of it's my fault. I should have done this or I shouldn't have done that.
mm,
And then C, there's also this yearning that people feel to be with their loved ones no matter the cost. So put all that together in a very vulnerable moment, and it's not uncommon that we have other people in the inner circle that are also at risk. So what a beautiful job your team did.
thank
Let's
you.
shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about what do we know? What do we know about the impact of proactive postvention, why it's needed, and so forth? And again, in thinking about this, I always say I'm a researcher with the little r. I dabble in it enough to be dangerous, but I'm not nearly at the level of like the Julie Sorrells of the world, who we'll talk a little bit about her research in a second. But I know when we started distributing those eye care packages, so similarly to your victim advocates, we would get a heads up from often actually from neighbors, church members, school
Yeah,
friends, or whatever, second tier level people that didn't know what to do to support this person, but knew that there had been a recent suicide. Sometimes we also got information from first responders, but it was more of these acquaintances in this person's life who really wanted to support. And we get these requests for our eye care packages, which again had tools and what to expect. And also, here's some resources. And we evaluated them and compared them to suicide loss survivors who did not get the eye care packages. And those who did get eye care packages were number one, more likely to seek resources, which makes sense because we showed
yep,
them a path. But interestingly, were less likely to use drinking to cope with their grief, which was a
yes.
surprising but amazing finding. So, and again, had never been replicated. Don't even know if that was truly what was going on, but that's what our preliminary findings indicated. And again, going back to Frank Campbell's research,
Yes.
uh, people stumble around. He calls it stumbling around in the dark forest until they finally trip over a resource 10 years into their grief journey. And by then we've
Yes.
got a lot of collateral damage, he calls it, families falling apart, kids dropping out of school, people losing their jobs, and so on. So what are some of the research, that justifies this kind of proactive postvention approach, and then anything that you have come, even anecdotally, that's demonstrating how helpful it can be?
I think Dr. Frank Campbell, his studies show that when we use the lost teams or first responders, like with grief, as in the care that you've done, but his studies showed that individuals who had someone meet with them early on to help navigate were 39 days where they sought out services support group following
Mhm.
the tragic death. And those who did not have those services early on, it was a 4.5 years.
Yeah,
Imagine that
huge.
4.5 years that your family, as Frank said, Dr. Campbell says, stumbling around, just trying to figure out how do you not only survive. I mean, we can't even think about thriving, right? It's just
Mhm,
breathing, just
mhm.
breathing. So I feel like how much more studies between your study, the other postventions, myself and a Dr. Beth Rowe from Saginaw Valley State University, we did a study. I think we had 249 survivors of suicide loss, anywhere from 5 months to 10 years. And the postvention 1 year after the death by suicide showed the people who helped them the most were their spouses, not support groups, not therapists, not primary care, but their spouses were the most helpful. And the
Mm,
barrier was the strongest barrier was more of the it wasn't really finances, it was their exhaustion, anxiety, and depression. So why do we not reach out to people after death to suicide if we know the long-term effects are more harmful, that ripple effect? Because suicide grief is complicated. There are resources out there, but when you lose someone to suicide, it's so hard to imagine that people understand you. You feel so lost. You feel so much blame and guilt and anger and confusion. So the study that we did was with Dr. Beth Rowe, SVSU, and it was, it was a study. It was a small sampling, but for me, it spoke volumes of who needs to be brought to the table. We need to train first responders, healthcare providers, primary care. The first thing a lot of primary care do is they medicate people. And I'm not saying some people don't need medication. I'm not saying that, but you can't take enough medications or sleeping pills to take away this pain. And
mhm.
addressing it head on, Iris Bolton says it beautifully, is we can't go around it, we have to go through it, right?
Yeah, someone
So,
said to me too when I was in the throes of it being really, I would call it disabling grief. I like couldn't
yeah.
function. She said, Sally, she had lost her mother in a tragic accident, but similar kind of sudden traumatic death experience. She said, your grief is the mirror of your love. And this is an experience of honoring. And so it's okay that it hurts because that's how deep your love was, and it's okay to be present with it because that's how you honor how much you loved him. And I thought, well, what a powerful reframe, because this feels so heavy and miserable. But if it's the mirror of my love, then yes, it needs to be
Yeah.
intense because I love him very much. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and imagine that sometimes my survivors and my support group, because they're my biggest teachers, right? My survivors are my biggest teachers. And they will say to me, Barb, I'm afraid to work through my grief because the amount of pain I feel is the amount of love I had. And I'm
Mm,
afraid that right now, all I can remember is their death. And the intensity of my pain allows me to be closer to them. And I thought, wow, like it allows you to be closer to them because of the pain that you feel. Like that feels awful. But the
mhm,
reality is, even though it feels awful, it's feeling them close to you. And I had a mom who had triplets, and one of her sons had taken his life at the age of, I think he was only like 17. And she said to me, Barb, it's like I feel closer to the son that died than the two here on earth because the pain I feel of his death is with me constantly 24/7. And I'm with my other boys when I'm physically with them, where I
mhm,
carry the one that had died with me always. And I thought
mhm.
that was powerful, right? Like you'll never forget the person that you lost, but we're going to carry them differently and we carry their grief differently.
Yes. Yeah, being 20 years out, it's an interesting how that grief kind of waxes and wanes. We'll get back to the research in a second, but you made me think about, like, I have this, and everybody deals with their grief differently. One of the things that I do, I found it helpful to compartmentalize and really focus on the grief when I could be safely able to do so. So that
Mhm.
for me turned into a ritual every year I do on his death anniversary where, I try to clear the day and just meditate and reflect on our relationship and our memories and just open myself up to him in many ways. And I feel still 20 years out, feel that still deep sense of profound grief. But I put my finger on it intentionally. And the reason why is because I don't ever wanna forget the reason why I do this work, and
Yeah.
that our relationship continues. It's just different to today, and I'm open to whatever he brings to me on that day, whatever that looks like as a pathway forward. So anyway, everybody's got their own way through it. But what the active postvention does is it helps people become unstuck, I think.
Yeah.
Unstuck and feeling profoundly alone, unstuck in the survivor guilt, and all the ways that people start to kind of really experience, again, the collateral pieces of this of relationships falling apart and financial issues and all of that other stuff. So let's talk a little bit about Jolie Sorrell's work too, because she's been such
Wow.
an instrumental researcher with a capital R in this space, and
Yes.
many others that have collaborated with her. Tell us a little bit about some of her findings, and again, why this active postvention piece is justified by some of her research.
Well, I appreciate, years ago, remember they said, and remember you and I are both sort of I think we're the
Right.
pioneers now. We're not like, I
We're
was
that
like, oh my
old.
God,
I
it makes me sound old, right? 30, what do they say, 3 decades? I'm like, that sounds
know.
old. But Julie Sorrell, Dr. Julie Sorrell, had found previously, they said for every death to suicide, 6 people were intimately impacted by that death. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that number has to be low. But I'm not even a R research. I'm not lowercase or uppercase. But the reality is there has to be more than 6 people impacted, right? That's just like the bare minimum. Like you'd have to be in such an isolated rural area that more than 6 people. So if you think about only 6 people, then well, Dr. Julie Sorrell did the new study, and she recognizes that about 135 people have been exposed to every death by suicide. So that's just exposed, right? So maybe coworkers that weren't really close, or maybe in a community, or maybe like someone in the social media that we didn't know, but they impacted us because we watched their movies. But she also did another, yeah, further in that study was 15 to 35 people were intimately impacted, meaning life changing. So if we think about the numbers between 15 and 35, to me, that makes more sense, right?
Mhm.
I would
Yeah.
hope if I died today, and I know it
Mhm.
sounds horrible, there'd be more than 6 people impacted.
Right. Right.
I'd like to
Mhm.
say there's one, two, three,
Mhm.
but I have to believe that there's more than six. So Dr. Julie Sorrell says between 15 and 35. So if we take the number even in the middle, maybe 25 people, and if there's almost 50,000 people that die by suicide a year in the United States, that's over 1,237,000 people
Mhm.
that have been impacted, not just exposed. That's a lot of people walking this journey alone, feeling like no one understands, but we don't. Like
Yeah.
so many more people have been, impacted, that we have to be able to talk about it and not put our heads down and not whisper, right? That's a big number.
It is a big number. And again, postvention strategies really help us think strategically on, where do we find people impacted and how can we best make a difference? And I think I remember her when she presented at AAS back in the day, she talked about, the different levels of being impacted. Some of them are major life disruptions, like dropping out of school or losing a job. And if I remember correctly, her innermost circle was profound life changes. So
Yes.
these are folks that carry this major disruption in their life for a very long time. And I think about the many parents that I've met that have lost children that a decade later they are still trying to find the quote unquote new normal. It's just not coming because so much of their who they are in this world fell out from under them when they lost that really important person. So again, these are all really important justifications for that proactive outreach for people who are suffering and often completely lost about how to rebuild or even where to start working there. We're addressing some of this grief and trauma. Let's turn our attention now to the now what. All right. So we've made the case for it. What does a loss team look like? How do they operate? And you have an additional component that's unique to your part of the world, which is the victim advocacy. Just tell us all about how that works, and how you train people and how you get people out into the communities.
So I'll start a little bit about the advocates, because in Michigan, we have victims advocates. We are trained through the Michigan Sheriff's Association, a 2.5 day training. And right now we have 650 advocates in the state, and we are out of 83 counties, we are in 57 counties. And this is where we are dispatched, called out for any first responders, but we're trained through the Sheriff's Association. It's homicide, suicide, baby deaths, fatalities, so any type of tragic death. And some counties use us more than others. It's a 2.5 day training. So if anyone is interested in Michigan, go to your Michigan Sheriff's Association. But across the country, we'd love for all states to have a victims advocate like you did in
Mhm,
Colorado, right? So
mhm.
yours was called, what was your group called?
Victims assistance. We were run through the Denver Police Department, and it was actually part of my graduate school. It was like an externship. It was a
Mhm.
highly sought after externship because it was one of the few that were paid. And when you're broke
Yeah.
graduate student, you look for that. But you're called out of your bed in
Yeah.
the middle of the night to go to someone's worst tragedy. It was a wake up call.
Yeah.
For someone who hadn't been exposed to this other part of what so many people go through every day, and also what the police officers are exposed to every single day.
So we get the opportunity to be with people on the onset, like they're sleeping and all of a sudden their life has changed. They're
Hmm.
having dinner and within seconds their life has changed. So we have an opportunity to minimize the trauma as much as possible and bring hope early on. So as victims advocate, you're trained in 2.5 days. And my hope is that anyone listening, go to your sheriff's association, go to your police and ask them about, do we have a team? And it takes a special person. You have to go in
Hmm.
people's homes and navigate, like, do you need a glass of water, and be comfortable going into the cupboard and getting them water as they're hyperventilating.
Hmm.
Knowing who your resources are in your county. And then the loss team is, our victims advocates are all trained in loss. We have 7 loss members in our county. And so for the loss team, the way we combined and merged ours is we go on all tragic deaths as advocates. And then if you are a loss team member, then we can offer a little more services at the scene, but then we always do one follow-up where the lost team goes to their home, offers them hope, talks about, what do you say at the funeral home? We call them the Aunt Lulus. Like when Aunt Lulu comes up and say, what happened? Did you see him? Like, they get all just gently say, thank you for coming. I appreciate you. We're still trying to figure it out. And then you turn your back on them. So we
Hmm.
tell people, like, we say, give suggestions. What do you say? What do you say to people when they say what happened? Like, is it okay to tell them it was suicide? We encourage them to talk about it was suicide. How do you tell your kids, right? We follow national guidelines on how do you tell the kids truth in a safe way. So for the loss team, we were trained through Dr. Frank Campbell. He came to Michigan twice. And we have a new trainer in the state of Michigan, Denise. She's from Ohio. And so we're starting pockets there. So Baton Rouge, Louisiana is their home base. So they can look up LOSS, LOSS, which is Local Outreach to Suicide Survivors. And this is where we meet with the families to say, I lost my brother to suicide. That's why I do the work that I do. I'm here to let you know that you too will survive this grief journey. And then we offer more resources from a suicide perspective, because my thoughts are, and it's not everyone's, is early on, some families, even though it's being investigated as a suicide, sometimes they're not ready to talk about suicide in those first hours. They're
Hmm.
not ready to admit it's a suicide. They're angry. They got, a lot of blame, a lot of guilt. And so I don't always wear my loss hat, even on a potential suicide. I use my victim hat, victim services hat as an advocate. And then I come back as a lost person wearing a little more information about suicide. But people have to be comfortable being around anger and blame and not wanting to take away their grief. early on, Sally, and I'm sure you were this way, is we want to take away people's grief. Like, we
Mhm.
knew they're gonna be
It's gonna
okay, and
be
don't
okay.
feel
Everything's gonna be
guilty.
fine.
Yeah,
This
don't
too
feel
shall pass.
guilty. It's not your
Mhm.
fault. Yeah, it's not your fault. Don't say that. But you know what? Everybody has to carry their own grief, and they have to deal with it in their own way, in their own time. And I had a gentleman who said it was 10 years and he heard me speak. He came through work. So it caught him off guard because of my talk. And he said, I still feel guilty about my son's suicide. Like, I did this. I was an alcoholic. I was an abusive man. I was in and out of prison. I did this to my son. I don't have a right to be a father to my other son. And so
Mhm.
I said to him, because I can't say that it's not your fault. I can't, that's not my place. But I can say is, what do you think you contributed to his death? And if you can change how you live because how you feel you contributed and be the father you really wanted to be to the son that you lost, be that father to the son who's still here on earth. And I'm telling you, it was like this whole weight was lifted from him, that I gave him permission to take responsibility for the father that he didn't appreciate, but to be
Mhm.
the father that he wants to be and to have that relationship that he wished he had. So I use that quote often, is what were you here to show me that only your death could teach me? I love that,
That is
right?
beautiful. Yes, it frees people up to,
Yeah,
put down the self-punishment and say, you have all of this journey ahead of you and you have an opportunity to create it differently. What does
yeah.
it look
I
like?
mean,
Mhm.
but we can't take away people's guilt. And some people, if they believe that they contributed, they can carry that until they're ready to put it on the shelf. We
Mhm.
just want to give information that will help them see that a lot of people have been abused or neglected and they survived. Why do some people die by suicide? I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know that last piece of the puzzle. We go to a scene and we say this 1,000-piece puzzle was just shooken up, thrown up in the
Yep.
air, and they're trying to put these pieces together. And would we do something different? I'd be a different sister, and probably you. If I knew he
Mhm.
was dying on that Sunday night, I sure as hell would have been with him Saturday night, hanging out, supporting him because of his, breakups and layoff from work, all the stuff that happens to young people. I didn't know he was suicide sad. I knew he was sad. I didn't know he was suicide sad. So I had to forgive myself for not hanging out with him that night. He asked me to go for a ride. I didn't. People will always say, "Oh, it wasn't your fault." Okay, thank you. Thanks for that
Mhm.
Band-Aid. You know,
Mhm.
I can feel what I feel. I don't know if he would have died. I know he would have died that night, but I don't know if he would have died another night.
Mhm.
And it's okay that I question that question.
Mhm.
I don't carry his, I don't carry it anymore. I don't feel guilty anymore, but you don't have to put a Band-Aid on whatever I think and feel. It's okay.
That's right. Yeah, and I was a full-fledged psychologist when Carson died. And so
Yeah,
and I did all the things I was supposed to do. I did all the things I was trained to do, and we still died. So
yeah,
then I just have that sometimes a sense of futility, like, oh
yeah,
my gosh. But then I've come to a place 20 years later where I'm like, there are so many variables that come into a point in time of which we only control one,
mm,
us,
yeah,
and the knowledge that we have at the time. So, I mean, there's other ways to turn that pain into purpose, but there you got to give yourself some grace as a suicide loss survivor about
yes.
what you can and cannot have influence over. And the other part I just wanted to address that you alluded to is I remember hearing anecdotally, like the in the victim assistance role that we play, that in the moment of the trauma, everything is so shocking and chaotic. It's very even hard to like sequence what is actually happening. And oftentimes the visit or the resource package that was left behind doesn't get fully appreciated or assimilated.
Yeah,
They have a vague memory that somebody came who had maybe some kind of similar experience, but a couple of weeks later, they're like, "What
yeah,
is this thing on the counter? Who left this here?" And then they open it up and they're like, "Oh, there's things for us." And
yeah.
that sets them forward. So even if you don't get a response right away, just know sometimes it takes a while for people to move through the shock to start
Mhm.
to think about what those next steps might be for them and their families. If there's a community out there, Barb, that hasn't put some of this together, doesn't have a victim's advocate ability, wherever they are, what do you recommend that they consider in helping families bereaved by suicide?
I really wish every funeral home, every church, every first responder, EMS worker, police has some resource in their county that they can bring to the family and that they can say, you might not need this today. And I always give it to the person who seems to be the one that's thinking the clearest. I don't give it to the mother who's wailing and crying in the
Mhm,
moment. I just
mhm,
touch her hand, right? But for
mhm.
the person that's there as a support, please find your information before you need it, right?
Yes.
Because suicide's gonna happen to almost all of us. I think it was 70% of us will know of someone who dies by suicide by the time we get to adulthood. So find the information and resources in your community. You can also call 211. Is that nationwide?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so 211 is a non-emergency phone number that most counties have in the country. You can go in that 211 and ask them, where's their local resource for suicide grief or people impacted by grief? Find out what counseling agency offers it or which grief groups. So 211 is a great resource, 988 is a great resource, and most people's community mental health will have resources for grief. So find out who your resources are before you need them, before the crisis happens.
Yes, and I'll put all of this in the chat. We also know that Alliance of Hope has a community forum that people can access from anywhere. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has a support group locator. Some of these are virtual support groups. So lots of opportunities there as well, even if you don't have something really active for postvention locally. So Barb, we're going to go back and do a little bit of a recap, and then I want to come back to you with your final thought. One call to action that you want to make sure that our listeners did not miss in our discussion today. So again, to recap, everyone who's listening, I'm speaking with the amazing Barb Smith, a true champion in suicide prevention and also suicide, grief, and trauma support locally in Michigan and nationally and internationally, just really pushing forward some best practices on how we can support people on this darkest day. She's a sister on a mission with me, doing this in honor of our brothers that we lost. The innovative approach of loss teams is truly community changing, from letting people stumble around in the dark to proactively reaching out to those most directly impacted and saying, this is really hard. A lot of times people need support. And a lot of times it's the lost survivors, the lost team are survivors themselves. So they can really say, I've gone
Yeah.
through something similar and I remember how hard it was. So I will walk with you. And just that message alone gives people hope. Well, if you have survived this, maybe I will too. Barb, what is something you want to make sure that our listeners take away from today?
I think there's two things. One, to remember that no one needs to walk this journey alone. Oftentimes we feel alone, but we don't need to walk the journey alone. And if you have that caring heart, if you've been impacted by suicide, please be sure that they reach out, find a grief support group, and to move when they start to move for not only surviving but thriving, that they help, they find purpose for their pain. So no one makes suicide happen, but what we can do with it is really up to us. Iris Bolton says it beautiful. Suicide changes us, but it doesn't have to destroy us.
That's so true. That's so true. Barb, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you now and always. If people want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Our website is srrn.net, Suicide Resource Response Network. So srrn.net. Our phone number is 989-781-5260, and I'm extension 2. We're not a crisis line, but I do tend to answer the phone as 24 hours a day. But we are, the 988 is the crisis line, but we want to be here. We want to be a resource. I'd love to come in and do a training on postvention and how we can be a resource. So either way, our Facebook page is I can't even tell you our Facebook page, but I think you'll put it online.
I will.
Um,
I'll put it in the show
it
notes for
is,
sure.
yeah, okay, it's Barb Smith SRN. So any way you can connect with us, we'd love to be a support.
And if people are curious about developing their own local loss team, they can come to you, or I will put it in the notes as well. They can go to Frank Campbell's website. These are such important community services that we can provide for
Yes.
people who are bereaved. Well, thank you again so much for your
Welcome.
expertise, your passion, decades of championing this forward. Thank you to the whole team behind making this podcast successful. Dave, Mitchell, Chase, Elias, Whitney, and many, many more that are making sure that it gets out and gets into the ears of people that can really make a difference. And thank you to you, all the listeners who made time for this conversation today. So, in closing, open your heart, challenge your thinking, and take action to save lives. Together, we can restore dignity and sustain a passion for living. Hey, everybody, this is Headspace for the Workplace. It's a podcast on how to cultivate vibrant and psychologically safe and healthy workplaces. Hello, hello. This is Sally, and today I'm connected to Barb Smith, and we are going to talk about something that's often overlooked, which is workplace postvention. I know for me, before I even knew this was a thing, I had it happen to me by my workplace. They did it so well, and they didn't even know that I'm going to start over. Stumble, stumble. Let me try again. Hey, everybody. It's Headspace for the Workplace, a podcast where we learn how to cultivate vibrant and psychologically safe and healthy workplaces. In today's conversation, I'm with Barb Smith, and we're going to talk about workplace postvention, what we do after a suicide death. And it makes me think back to when Carson died, and I used to work at Regis University, and they didn't know what workplace postvention was, but they did all the right things. They gave me accommodations. They supported me in my grief. They were incredibly understanding in connecting me to suicide loss survivor groups, and they followed me in my grief journey for a very long time. Is your workplace getting it right? Chances are no. So that's where we're headed today. And Barb, what are the two main tactical takeaways we hope our listeners walk away with today?
Well, is your EAP,
All right, let's try again. It's okay.
what does that say? Your EAP may not be paired. Oh,
It's the first one was on belonging,
okay.
creating a
Sorry.
place of belonging. It's okay. Let me clap. Hold on. Barb, what are the two tactical takeaways that our listeners going to walk away with today?
Well, creating a place of belonging and family when a suicide impacts your workplace, and your EAP may not be prepared to help.
That sounds important because I think a lot of workplaces depend on their EAP for all things mental health and certainly mental health emergencies. So that's going to be an important one to unpack. Well, let's go learn a little bit more about you, Barb. What do you do every day that makes a difference in this postvention space?
Sure. Well, our mission is to prevent suicide through education, advocacy, connection to resources, and care for people impacted by suicide. So there's a couple of hats that I wear. One is the prevention efforts, which we do a lot of trainings. We do a lot of trainings in the workplace to help people feel comfortable and confident and having the open and direct conversation around suicide. Because whether you are the CEO, the supervisor, or just a coworker, we need everyone to be comfortable in having that conversation, especially in a postvention when people are coming back to work. What do we say? Do we acknowledge them? Do we give them a hug? How much time do they need off? So we kind of give a lot of information about that. And then we're a resource. So a lot of times HR will call me, like we have an employee that we're going to have to release. They've been, drinking or missing work. So I also give them words and, conversation about how do you release them in a way that's safe. And then we do the postvention after a death to suicide. We're brought into organizations or companies. Part of it is CISM, but a lot of it is we use components of CISM, which is
What is CISM?
critical incident
Stress debriefing.
stuff management, incident stress
CISM.
management. Yes, SISM. So part of it is where it's not as organized as that, but we come in after a tragic death of employees to help navigate the early hours and days so that we care for all employees. So that's what I love to do. That's on my daily agendas. I am a survivor of suicide loss, and my workplace was not as great as yours following a death to suicide. So, they gave me my few days off work. And I remember he died in July. And in Christmas that year, I just said, man, I'm really struggling. She goes, he's been dead a long time, Barb.
Brutal.
How long is this going to take? And I remember saying, I don't know. If your brother died today, how long would it take? And I thought, oh, that
Good
was
for you.
probably
Good for
not.
you.
But, we were young. We didn't understand and they didn't understand. But I think and I hope companies are more prepared to help families after a death to suicide.
I think my workplace did even more than I know about because I had been on maternity leave for 3 months. He died December 7th. They got me through the holidays. I'd already burned all my leave. They got me through the holidays. They threw in a couple extra days. I'm pretty sure there was a community rallying just to help me, figure out my way back. So a
Beautiful.
lot of different experiences that people have with their workplace response because workplaces are really not prepared. And this work is hard. And what's
Yes.
something recently you've done to take care of yourself?
Oh, recently, do you want to know what you want to know about me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, my daughter called and she was volunteering for the Paralympics in Paris. And she said, Mom, I haven't seen you because she lives out by you in Colorado. And so I flew out, met her in Paris. And oh my gosh, it was an experience of resilience and
Mm,
people that empowered us and just stories of hope and resilience was amazing. And of course, Paris, I'd never thought about. We visited everything in 5 days, including the Eiffel Tower, delicious food, beautiful walks, and just great conversation with my daughter, but also the local people. And of course, being part of the Paralympics was unbelievable.
yes. So for everyone out there on the front lines doing this hard work of suicide prevention, mental health promotion, addiction recovery, very important that we take these breaks with our family and fuel our soul, as my friend Sarah Gear likes to say. So let's
Yes.
go unpack your first one, which is creating a place of belonging and family when a suicide impacts your workplace. Why is this so essential?
I feel that we lose a lot of employees when we don't care for them after a family member has died by suicide, but also for the employees. Like they see how their CEO or how their boss responds. And if we don't show them that we care and we are extended, your extended family, we want to be here for you, people get a bad taste in their mouth. Like, yeah, somebody kills himself and they don't even care. It's like work goes on like nothing. Like they're more worried about work and getting back on the schedule and productivity. So a lot of times they'll lose employees because of the bad attitudes and the way people handled it. But workplace, right? They know they need some structure. So there's really that hard balance between do we keep the shop open? Do we
Hmm.
require people to come in? Did they get paid to go to the funeral home?
Hmm.
So I feel like it's really important that do we share and show the surviving employees and or the family member of the deceased that we are your work family and we do care about you.
Absolutely. I would say those tensions in postvention right there, the balance piece that you talked about. I think when you're intentionally looking at them, you can create a pathway forward. And so one of those pathways that you just brought up is, how long do we sit in this space of
Yeah.
trauma and grief response? And then when do we go back to work? Both things are important. So let's
Yes.
intentionally focus on making that right balance. Because if you err too much on one or the other, then again, people can get stuck in certain places or feel like nobody cares. And so you might need to co-create that with the people that are most directly involved. Like, what's most helpful to you? What do you need right now? Because, like you, I've heard countless stories of people, they get like an all hands news blast at 10 a.m. in the morning that someone has died by suicide. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, it's like, where's your report? Or, we
Yes.
have this other business meeting that we attend to, and nobody can get their mind around any of the day to day minutia work that needs to be done when something so big has happened, let alone the people who are also struggling with suicidal thoughts, depression, anxiety, whatever, and they're
Yes.
seeing how the workplace is treating this situation, then it's not a safe place for me to come out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like they act like nothing happened and they don't care. But reality is I think it comes down from the top, educating and sharing. This is why we're doing what we do. Like we're not just going on with business as usual, but some people need to go on with business because it's too hurtful for them to sit in it. So we want to respect all people. So if you need times and space, we want to honor that, but we can't assume that everyone wants time and space like kids going to school, right? Do we hold school when a teacher dies? Some kids, the best place for them to be is at school that day, right? Because that's where they're cared for and, they're going to be safe. It's the same thing as workspaces. Some people to go home to an empty house where there's drinking or drugging, they might need to go to work and be productive that day to keep their mind busy. So it's
Right.
balancing, right? But I think when the top explains why they're doing what they're doing, it helps them feel more cared for and understood instead of the attitude.
And giving people choices on what's most useful to
Yeah.
them too. And I always say, whatever you do when an employee has died of cancer or died in a car wreck, or whatever your plan is to
Yes,
address the grief and trauma related to those things, like start there. Because if you deviate from what those business practices are usually, you better have a really good reason, because
yes.
people are expecting to honor their colleague, or stand by that employee whose loved one has died by suicide, and honor that grief collectively as a community. So start with whatever those practices are. If you circulate a sympathy card and bring chicken casserole to that, then do
Yes.
that. Like whatever you usually do, start there. So let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go to the second one, which I think might be a little shocker for people. Is that your EAP might not be prepared. I think a lot of workplaces, when they go through their checklist about what are we going to do, they're like, oh, EAP is going to come and save the day. Why is EAP not necessarily? Some of them are prepared, so we want to acknowledge that, but most of them are woefully underprepared or not prepared at all. So why might they not be prepared to help?
I think that EAPs oftentimes are the Band-Aid to say we have EAP, which is Employee Assistance Program. It's usually an adder on their health plan, right? It's usually an adder to, it's more for mental health, but also EAPs are underutilized because people are not aware of them or they've had bad experience. And then so that ripple effect goes through work, like, yeah, don't use them, don't call them. So EAPs, in my opinion, should be trained agencies who are specifically trained in your workspace. So first responders are a different type of people, right? They need someone in EAP who understand first responders and the work life that they have. Maybe healthcare and physicians should have an EAP who understand healthcares and their barriers and their challenges. EAP for educators and teachers who understand that workplace. So EAP should not be a quick Band-Aid, and we got this one for $15.99 per person. Um, right? We need EAPs who are certified or at least have knowledge of the careers or the occupation of those companies that you're serving. And EAPs should be have understanding in suicide because it's going to happen in most companies, right? And if you don't understand suicide grief and the complications with it, you can do more damage than good.
Yeah, and I also think, yeah, so much there. I also think when workplaces are like, check the box, bring the EAP in, a lot of people in the immediate aftermath of a trauma so devastating as suicide, even if it didn't happen at a job site, it's just still so shocking for people. They're not able to put words to feelings or figuring out what they're going through. It's just they're in shock. So having your EAP, even the good ones that are very prepared for this, show up is mostly symbolic at that point,
Yes.
like and predictive for people. Like, you may need this down the way. We're here for you. Really helpful. But there's not a lot of therapy that's going to happen in the 2 to 3 days after a suicide death. So EAP can come and start coaching with the managers on, here's some things you might expect and look forward to. And should these things show up, here's how you could be a bridge to us. For workplaces to think all problems will be solved when the EAP and the cavalry come running in on day two,
Yes.
not going to happen. This is going to be a much longer tail of response. And then for the EAPs, it's really important proactively, right, to make sure that they're prepared, because chances are they're not, and that they have the tools to address mental health emergencies like the aftermath of a suicide at
Yes.
that impacting work. You and I have worked collaboratively on the manager's guide to the postvention, action steps that workplaces can take. And you could just unpack that for us as we're trying to, let people know that there are certain best practices and what to do in the first couple days, couple weeks, even months.
So just a couple notes that I feel are really important. Don't take the word of other employees or family members what happened. Your head management or HR should be calling law enforcement and confirming, is this what happened? Get your facts straight because, if the individual is on life support following an attempted suicide, that's not a suicide death yet.
Mhm.
So get your facts straight by calling your local dispatch, asking them if you can talk to the officer on scene that the the sergeant on scene, get your facts straight first. Then you have someone from the workplace, depending on if a larger or small company. Smaller companies, it's nice to have a coworker that knew them or the head of the department. If it's a larger company, making sure HR calls the family members and said, we're so sorry for what happened to your son today. We want to do right by your family. Is it okay that we send out the release that your loved one or Joe died by suicide today? because we know that people know, and we need them to know that if they're having thoughts, that we are that safe place that can talk to them. And a lot of times families are like, I don't want anybody to know. I don't say talk them into it, but talk them through it. We know that if one person knows, then other people will know, and your family did nothing wrong. We just want to make sure that we're here for them and for our surviving employees to know that we are going to be here for you as a family, but secrets are not always helpful.
Yes, and
So,
I think most families also don't know that cause of death is public record, that if people are super curious,
yeah,
they are going
yeah,
to be able to find out. And so I also think, I don't know, because you're just so bottled up into your own experience
yes.
that they can actually play a really important role in helping others in this moment. And that's really it can turn the corner for people
Yes,
that this isn't about.
maybe, and I think, Sally, making sure that it's okay with families, a lot of
Mhm.
workplaces are like, "Oh, we wanna do this fundraiser, we want to do this for the family." The family should be involved in that. As a
Yes.
workplace, is it okay if we create a memorial for your loved one? Like, having that liaison from the workspace be part of that decision making, and don't assume that they want it, right? So number one is making sure that you have a navigator or a liaison in your workplace, one person that can deal with media, the family, all the other employees, what happens next, having your substitutes, if it's a teacher or if it is a whole department that's impacted, who's going to cover those roles, calling other workplaces out of county. So you need multiple people early on that are going to be involved. So have your core group of people, and each of them brings back to the one person who is, I call more the hub, right?
Mhm.
Who's the coordinator on site? Is it your HR? Is it the principal? Is it the CEO? Who is your one person that's gathering all the information to make sure surviving employees are taken care of? You're doing right by the family and anyone who may have been intimately impacted, especially if the death happened at work. So,
Excellent.
and who's taking care of media, right?
Mhm.
So making sure everybody knows who that one person is that's gathering all the information. Having the liaison immediately connecting with the family, making sure the family's okay with. We talked about Suicidal American Association for Suicide or American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We'll put those sites up. And there's also suicide prevention in the workplace. There's a template. What do you send to the other employees? What do you send out? There's one that if the family agrees that they'll
Mhm.
talk about the cause of death, and there's one if the family disagrees for announcing it. But ensuring that it's a template for safe messaging.
Yes, so you don't have to
Like,
come up with it from
don't have
scratch.
to come up to it
That's
in the
right.
middle of the night. You've got to work at 6 a.m., it's 4
Right.
a.m. Click on it, get it going and do it right and do it well to minimize the trauma. Because once that information gets out there, and if you're a large company, it is a mess.
That's right.
So
So
the sooner you go to these websites, the better that you can do it in a safe way.
yeah, we'll put the manager's guide to suicide postvention in the landing page. So just so you know, this has been thought through and tested for quite some time, and it's really helped a lot of managers who are also often fellow grievers. Right? They knew this person, or they knew this person's family member who died by suicide. So that we acknowledge that they're in a place of being impacted themselves, and now they've got to drive this response forward. And so it's checklists and flow charts and templates and all of those
Yes.
things. So I'm going to do a quick recap, Barb, and then I'm going to come back for the one major thing that you want to make sure that our listeners take away from today. So we're talking about workplace postvention with Barb Smith out of Michigan. And postvention is what we do after there's been a suicide death. And most workplaces are caught on their heels when this happens. They do not have a plan. But it's important to have a plan because the decision making is sensitive and it's tricky. There's a lot of tensions in postvention. On one hand, we want to acknowledge something significant's happened here. On the other hand, when and where do we go back to the mission and making widgets or whatever that we're doing? We also think that a lot of workplaces believe that if I just call the EAP, they'll take care of everything. And I think Barb just outlined for us many things that the EAP is not going to be able to manage for you, that you need an internal team that is prepared quickly to navigate this because so many things can go awry when we don't go do it well. The gossip, the misinformation, the exposure effect where we talk about suicide in a non-helpful way. So some of the tips she brought out: confirming that it's a suicide death, get your facts together, really having the family's consent. It's so important that the family's involved and that you have their partnership and consent in how this moves forward, on what is okay or not okay to do. Having a navigator or a hub, some one person that's gathering the information, dealing with the media, making sure that the family's in supportive place, dealing with the other survivors, and so on. So much rich information here. Barb, what is one thing you want to make sure that people walk away with today?
Well, do you have if you have an evacuation plan, if there's a fire at work, then what are you doing to create a plan for suicide postvention? Don't wait for the incident to happen. Be prepared. Check out the site that, Sally's offering you for our workplace suicide prevention and also the guidance for the management. Like, so get your ducks in a row, create the plan for postvention. Don't wait till you need it, but be prepared.
That's great. Absolutely. So thank you, Barb. If people want to get in touch with you more to talk about your work in postvention, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Our website is srrn.net, or my email is barb.smith@srrn.net, which is Suicide Resource and Response Network. So we look forward to hearing from you. Be safe and be well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being my partner in this work. Always learning so much from you, and it's just great to have other people locking arms together on this, because not a lot of people are addressing this part of the suicide prevention and intervention postvention continuum. So I'm grateful. Thank you so much too to all the people that make this podcast good and great. Elias and Dave and Mitchell and Chase and Whitney and many others. And thank you, all the listeners that made this a priority today. So in closing, working minds work well together. There's lots we can learn from each other to improve the well-being of our workplace. Until we meet again, take care.